Imagine a city that has been burned to the ground, rebuilt and burned again, not once, not twice, but so many times that historians have lost count. Imagine walls soaked in the blood of 100 generations. Imagine a place so desired by so many civilizations that its very name became synonymous with conflict. In 70 AD, Roman legions under a young general named Titus reduced this city to rubble so completely that not one stone of its most sacred temple was left standing upon another. Nearly 1 million people perished. The streets ran with blood and fire. Survivors were crucified by the thousands along the roads leading out of the city. And yet, the city came back. It always came back. This is Jerusalem, sacked more times than perhaps any other city in human history, desired by empires, prophets, kings, and crusaders, fought over for 3,000 years. This is the complete story of every time Jerusalem fell, who took it, how they did it, and what they left behind. Stay with us, because we are just getting started. Before we dive into the battles, we need to understand why this city, perched on a rocky limestone plateau with no river, no natural harbor, and no agricultural abundance, became the most fought-over piece of real estate in human history. The answer is both simple and profound: geography, religion, and pride. Jerusalem sits at the intersection of 3 continents. The ancient trade routes connecting Egypt to Mesopotamia, Africa to Asia, all funneled through or near this highland city. Whoever controlled Jerusalem controlled the crossroads of the ancient world. But beyond the strategic, there was the sacred. For Jews, it was the city of David, the site of Solomon's temple, the dwelling place of God. For Christians, it was where Christ was crucified and resurrected. For Muslims, it was where the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven on his night journey. No other city on earth has ever carried such weight for so many faiths simultaneously. That combination of strategic importance and religious sanctity made Jerusalem a prize unlike any other. It also made it a target. Over approximately 3,000 years of recorded history, the city has been besieged, captured, sacked, burned, and rebuilt at least 44 times. What follows is the story of those sieges, the generals, the soldiers, the tactics, the turning points, and the human cost of an obsession that has never truly ended. Long before Jerusalem became the holy city we know today, it was a modest Canaanite hilltop settlement known as Jebus, inhabited by a people called the Jebusites. The earliest recorded military conflict over the city comes from the chaotic Bronze Age period when Egyptian hegemony over Canaan was beginning to fracture. Egyptian records, including the famous Amarna letters from roughly 1350 BCE, show the king of Jerusalem, a man named Abdi-Heba, desperately writing to Pharaoh Akhenaten begging for troops, reporting that his lands were being raided by groups he called the Hapiru, possibly an early reference to Hebrew-speaking peoples or simply a general term for displaced, landless raiders. These were not yet the organized Israelite armies of later centuries. This was the Bronze Age in its most turbulent form, city-states constantly warring, populations shifting, Egyptian authority crumbling. The Jebusites managed to hold their city through most of this chaos. Their fortification, built on a narrow ridge above 2 valleys, the Kidron to the east and the Tyropion to the west, made direct assault almost suicidal. Attackers would have to charge uphill against defenders who could rain down arrows, stones, and spears from above. The Jebusites developed a culture of defiance. According to the later Hebrew texts, they were so confident in their city's defenses that they reportedly told an approaching enemy that the blind and the lame could hold it against them. Whether that boast was ever literally spoken, it captures the spirit of early Jerusalem perfectly, a small city with an enormous amount of confidence in its own impregnability. That confidence would eventually be shattered, but not for several more centuries. The first truly documented and historically significant sacking of Jerusalem was carried out by one of the ancient world's most celebrated warrior kings, David of Israel. Around 1000 BCE, following his unification of the Israelite tribes and his defeat of the Philistines, David set his sights on Jebus. The city was strategically perfect for a capital, central between his northern and southern tribal allies, defensible and not previously owned by any single Israelite tribe, which meant it would not favor any faction. David's forces numbered somewhere in the range of 10 to 20,000 fighting men, though precise figures from this era are impossible to verify. His military was organized around a core of professional warriors, men who had followed him since his days as an outlaw in the wilderness, supplemented by tribal levies. His top commanders included Joab ben Zeruiah, his ruthless and brilliant nephew who functioned as a kind of joint chief of staff, and the 30 and the 3, elite fighting units analogous to modern special forces who served as shock troops. The Jebusites, true to their reputation, mocked David. The biblical account in 2 Samuel tells us they stationed their disabled citizens on the walls as a taunt, believing their city was impenetrable. What happened next is one of the earliest recorded examples of a covert infiltration tactic. David reportedly told his men that whoever struck the Jebusites first should use the tzinner, a Hebrew word that has been translated as water shaft, tunnel, or grappling hook, depending on the scholar. The most compelling interpretation, supported by archaeology, is that David's men entered the city through a vertical water shaft, now known as Warren's Shaft, that the Jebusites had built to access the Gihon spring below the city without going outside the walls. Joab led this infiltration force, emerging inside the city walls and opening the gates from within. The Jebusites, surprised by enemies appearing in their interior, were overwhelmed. There is no record of mass slaughter. David appears to have incorporated the Jebusite population into his new kingdom rather than exterminating them. He renamed the city of David, transferred the Ark of the Covenant there with great ceremony, and set about transforming a Canaanite hilltop fort into the capital of a kingdom. The turning point of this engagement was not brute force, but ingenuity. The water shaft infiltration bypassed all of the Jebusites' formidable natural defenses in a single stroke. It is a reminder that throughout Jerusalem's history, sieges were often decided not by who had the most soldiers, but by who found the cleverest approach. After the conquest, David controlled a unified Israelite kingdom with Jerusalem as its capital. His son Solomon would later build the first temple here, transforming the city from a political capital into the sacred center of Israelite religion. Before we go further, drop a comment below. If you had to defend Jerusalem in the ancient world, which natural feature would you rely on most? The valleys, the hilltop position, or the water supply? Let's see what you think. Solomon's kingdom did not survive his death intact. The unified monarchy split in two, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, with Jerusalem remaining the capital of Judah. This division immediately weakened both states, and opportunistic neighbors were quick to notice. The first major external threat came from Egypt. Pharaoh Shoshenq I, known as Shishak, had built a powerful military force and saw the fractured Hebrew kingdoms as easy targets. Around 925 BCE, he launched a massive campaign into Canaan with an army that Egyptian records suggest, numbered in the tens of thousands, organized into chariot squadrons, infantry, and Libyan mercenary units. Shoshenq's chariot corps was among the finest in the Near East, fast, mobile, and capable of rapidly enveloping infantry formations. The king of Judah at the time was Rehoboam, Solomon's son, whose political blunders had caused the kingdom's split. He was not in a strong position to resist. Rather than fighting, Rehoboam apparently chose to pay. The biblical account describes him emptying the treasuries of the temple and the royal palace, including the famous gold shields that Solomon had made, and presenting them to Shishak. Shoshenq's own inscriptions at Karnak Temple in Egypt record the campaign triumphantly, listing over 150 cities he claimed to have subjugated. This was not a traditional sacking in the sense of mass destruction and killing. It was an enforced tribute collection backed by overwhelming military threat. Shishak demonstrated that he could take Jerusalem if he chose to. Rehoboam was wise enough not to find out. The city survived largely intact, but the treasury was stripped. After the raid, Egypt retained no permanent presence. Judah continued under the Davidic dynasty, poorer and more vulnerable than before. One of the most humiliating chapters in Jerusalem's early history came not from a foreign empire, but from a fellow Hebrew. Around 786 BCE, Amaziah, king of Judah, picked a fight he was not prepared to win. Flush with a recent victory over Edom, he he sent a provocative challenge to Jehoash, king of the northern kingdom of Israel. Jehoash's response, preserved in the second book of Kings, is one of the ancient world's finest pieces of diplomatic sarcasm. He compared Amaziah to a thistle that presumed to marry a cedar, warning him that he would be crushed underfoot. Amaziah ignored the warning. The two armies met at Beth Shemesh in the Shephelah foothills west of Jerusalem. Israel's forces, battle-hardened and numerically superior, routed Judah's army decisively. Amaziah himself was captured alive on the battlefield, an almost unprecedented humiliation for a reigning king. Jehoash then marched on Jerusalem unopposed. He breached the northern wall, the most vulnerable section, over a stretch of roughly 200 cubits, approximately 300 feet of wall demolished to make a point. He stripped the temple and the palace of gold, silver, and valuables, took hostages from the Judahite nobility, and returned to Samaria. He did not attempt to occupy the city or destroy it. This was a punitive raid designed to demonstrate dominance. Jerusalem survived again, wounded but standing. Coming up, the most powerful empire the ancient world had ever seen turns its full military might against Jerusalem. The Assyrian war machine is headed south, and nothing in Judah is prepared for what's coming. When the Assyrian Empire reached the height of its power in the late 8th century BCE, it operated on a scale that had no precedent in the ancient Near East. The Assyrian army was not merely large, it was an industrial killing machine, the product of generations of military refinement. Tiglath-Pileser III, Shalmaneser V, and Sargon II had built it into the most sophisticated military force the world had yet seen. And when Sennacherib inherited the throne around 705 BCE, he brought that machine down onto the rebellious states of the Levant like a hammer. Hezekiah, king of Judah, was among the leaders who rebelled against Assyrian dominance in coalition with Egypt and other regional powers. He was not naive about the risk. In preparation for the coming storm, he undertook one of the most impressive engineering projects, the Siloam Tunnel, a 1,750-foot channel cut through solid rock to bring water from the Gihon Spring inside the city walls. He also reinforced Jerusalem's walls, stockpiled supplies, and reorganized his military. The ancient inscription commemorating the tunnel's completion was discovered in 1880 and remains one of the oldest Hebrew inscriptions ever found. Sennacherib invaded Judah in 701 BCE with a force that Assyrian records describe in grandiose but partially credible terms. Likely somewhere between 40 and 60,000 fighting men, including cavalry, chariots, infantry, engineers, and siege specialists. He systematically destroyed Judah's fortified cities. Lachish, Judah's second most important city, fell after a brutal siege. Sennacherib commemorated this in an elaborate relief carved on the walls of his palace at Nineveh. One of the most detailed depictions of ancient siege warfare ever discovered, showing siege ramps, battering rams, archers, and mass impalement. Then Sennacherib turned to Jerusalem. He surrounded it. His own inscriptions describe locking Hezekiah in the city like a bird in a cage. He sent envoys to demand surrender, and the speech recorded in 2 Kings is a masterpiece of psychological warfare. The Assyrian officer called the Rabshakeh addressed the people on the city walls in Hebrew, telling them not to trust their king, not to trust their God, and reminding them that no other god had ever stopped Assyria. The crowd fell silent, and then something extraordinary happened. Sennacherib did not take Jerusalem. The Bible attributes this to divine intervention. The angel of the Lord struck down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in the night. The Greek historian Herodotus claims that an outbreak of mice consumed the Assyrians' bowstrings and equipment, perhaps a garbled account of a plague. Modern historians have proposed bubonic plague, cholera, or a political crisis. Sennacherib's own annals do not claim to have conquered Jerusalem, a conspicuous omission for a king who recorded every other victory. Whatever the cause, Jerusalem survived. Hezekiah paid a staggering tribute: 30 talents of gold, 800 talents of silver, precious stones, ivory, and his own daughters. But the city stood. The turning point was perhaps the plague, perhaps the tribute, perhaps Sennacherib's political distractions. What mattered to the people of Jerusalem was that their city, their temple, and their king had survived the most powerful army on earth. That experience lodged itself deep in Judahite religious memory as proof that God protected Jerusalem. That belief would prove dangerously seductive in the century that followed. The Assyrian Empire collapsed with remarkable speed in the late 7th century BCE, crushed between the resurgent Babylonians and the Medes. In 612 BCE, Nineveh, Assyria's great capital, fell. A new power center emerged at Babylon, led by the Chaldean dynasty, and its most famous king would become the defining catastrophe of ancient Jewish history. Nebuchadnezzar II came to power in 605 BCE and immediately demonstrated that he intended to dominate the entire Near East. He defeated the Egyptians at Carchemish in one of the great decisive battles of the ancient world, effectively ending Egyptian pretensions to control the Levant. Judah found itself caught between these superpowers, and the succession of kings who followed Josiah made increasingly poor decisions about which empire to support. King Jehoiakim of Judah initially submitted to Nebuchadnezzar, then reversed course and withheld tribute, hoping Egypt would rescue him. It was a fatal miscalculation. Nebuchadnezzar moved against Jerusalem in late 598 BCE. Jehoiakim died before the siege fully materialized, possibly murdered by his own courtiers. His 18-year-old son Jehoiakim inherited both the throne and the crisis. The Babylonian army that surrounded Jerusalem was formidable: heavy infantry, archers, siege engineers, and cavalry. Nebuchadnezzar's forces were heirs to both Assyrian and Chaldean military traditions, experienced at siege warfare. They did not need elaborate siege works. The city's leadership capitulated quickly. After 3 months, Jehoiakim surrendered. Nebuchadnezzar's response was measured, but devastating. He did not destroy the city. Instead, he took the king, the royal court, 10,000 skilled craftsmen and soldiers, the entire administrative class of Judah. He transported them to Babylon, placed a puppet king, Zedekiah, on the throne, and stripped the temple of its treasures. Jerusalem stood, but it had been hollowed out. The ruling class that made it function was gone. Zedekiah, the puppet king, made the same mistake. He listened to Egyptian promises of support and revolted. Jeremiah the prophet begged him not to, arguing that submitting to Babylon was God's will. He was imprisoned for treason. No one wanted to hear it. In 588 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar returned. This time, he was not interested in negotiation. The Babylonian army, estimated at 20,000 to 40,000 soldiers, surrounded Jerusalem. They built siege works, earthen ramps, wooden siege towers, battering rams against the walls. The siege lasted 18 months. It was one of the most grueling in the ancient world. Inside the walls, conditions deteriorated catastrophically. Famine was so severe that mothers boiled their own children. Disease spread. The Book of Lamentations describes the horror. A brief moment of hope arose when an Egyptian army marched north, temporarily lifting the siege, but the Babylonians defeated the Egyptians and returned to complete their work. That brief respite, which raised and then crushed hope, may have been the cruelest moment of all. The walls finally gave way in July or August of 587 or 586 BCE. Babylonian troops poured through a breach in the northern wall. Zedekiah fled with his bodyguard. He was caught near Jericho, brought before Nebuchadnezzar, and forced to watch his sons executed, then had his own eyes put out. The last thing he ever saw was the death of his children. He was taken in chains to Babylon, where he died in prison. The destruction of Jerusalem that followed was systematic and total. The Temple of Solomon, adorned with cedar and gold, housing the Ark of the Covenant, was burned to the ground. The palace complex was burned. The walls were demolished. Nebuzaradan oversaw the destruction with military precision, stripping the temple of every remaining bronze, gold, and silver object and sending them to Babylon. The casualties and deportees from this second siege were enormous, likely amounting to tens of thousands. The remaining population, the poorest farmers and vineyard workers, were left behind to tend the land. The city itself was a ruin. The turning point of this siege was the failure of Egyptian intervention. When the Egyptians retreated, Jerusalem's last hope evaporated. The lesson Jerusalem's defenders drew from 701 BCE, that their city was divinely protected, had made them reckless. It would take the shock of total destruction to reset that assumption. This moment became the defining trauma of Jewish history. The grief of the Babylonian exile echoes through the Psalms, through Lamentations, through Jewish liturgy to this day. Nebuchadnezzar held Jerusalem as part of his empire, administered through Babylonian governors. The land of Judah became a province of Babylon, and the Jerusalem that had been the center of Israelite civilization ceased to exist. Here's something to think about. If you were Zedekiah, knowing what you know about Babylonian power, would you have submitted? Or would you have rolled the dice on Egyptian support? Leave your answer below. Babylon itself did not last. Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon in 539 BCE. One of Cyrus's first acts was to issue his famous edict, allowing displaced peoples to return to their homelands. The Jewish exiles in Babylon were permitted to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. This is not a sacking, it is the opposite. It sets the stage for the next 4 centuries of Jerusalem's history. The city rebuilt under the Persian period, the Second Temple, completed around 515 BCE, was modest. The walls remained largely unrepaired for decades until Nehemiah arrived with Persian authorization to rebuild them. Jerusalem was a second-tier provincial capital in a vast Persian empire, protected but never again fully independent. When Alexander III of Macedon swept through the Persian Empire, Jerusalem found itself in his path. In 332 BCE, fresh from his siege of Tyre, Alexander moved south through Canaan. Jerusalem, unlike the Samaritan capital, appears to have capitulated without resistance. Alexander reportedly honored the Jewish God and exempted the Jewish people from tribute in sabbatical years. He was pragmatic, needing Levantine cities as supply depots, and had no desire to waste time on sieges. Alexandria in Egypt, not Jerusalem, became Alexander's great city of the Levant. For Jerusalem, the Macedonian conquest meant a relatively gentle transition to Greek hegemony. Alexander did not sack it. He barely paused there. The city continued under high priestly administration, now answering to Macedonian overlords instead. After Alexander died in 323 BCE, his empire was carved apart by his generals in the wars of the Diadochi. Jerusalem found itself in the middle of the contest between Ptolemy, who controlled Egypt, and various rivals. Ptolemy the Phaeosoter took Jerusalem around 320 BCE. He attacked on the Sabbath, knowing the Jewish population would not fight. The city fell with minimal resistance. Ptolemy deported a substantial number of the Jewish population to Egypt. He used them to populate Alexandria and other Egyptian cities. The Jewish community of Alexandria became an important intellectual center. Jerusalem passed between Ptolemaic and Seleucid control multiple times. The Ptolemaic period was generally tolerant. The city was administered, taxed, and occasionally fought over, but not destroyed. What would trigger revolt was cultural assault. Stay with us, because what comes next is one of the most grotesque acts of religious desecration in ancient history. A Greek king is about to do the unthinkable in the most sacred building in Jerusalem, shaking the entire Near East. Antiochus IV, the Seleucid king, combined military force with deliberate cultural destruction. He called himself Epiphanes, God manifest. His critics called him Epimanes, the madman. Both titles capture something true about him. Antiochus, impressed by Roman civilization, returned to his throne convinced Greek culture was superior. He believed Hellenization, cultural assimilation, was the fastest path to a unified empire. Most peoples accepted this, but the Jews did not. The Jewish community in Jerusalem was divided. Hellenized Jews wanted Greek culture, language, and philosophy. The high priesthood became a political football, auctioned by Greek monarchs and Jewish collaborators. Antiochus invaded Egypt twice. On his second return, Roman envoy Gaius Popilius Laenas confronted him. Antiochus, furious and humiliated, withdrew. He took out his rage on Jerusalem. In 169 BCE, he entered the temple and stripped it of gold, the altar, the lampstand, everything of value. In 167 BCE, he installed a garrison on the Acra overlooking the Temple Mount. He banned Jewish religious practice. Violators were executed. Then he committed the defining outrage. He erected an altar to Zeus in the temple. He sacrificed pigs on it. The Book of Daniel calls this the abomination of desolation. Antiochus likely had no idea what he had unleashed. This triggered the Maccabean revolt, a guerrilla war led by Mattathias and his son Judas Maccabeus, whose name means the hammer. Judas was a great irregular warfare commander. His forces used the Judean hills brilliantly, ambushing Seleucid columns. In 164 BCE, 3 years after the temple's desecration, Judas Maccabeus retook Jerusalem. The Seleucid garrison held the Acra, but could not prevent the Maccabees from purifying and rededicating the temple. This event is commemorated annually in the Jewish festival of Hanukkah. Judas's tactical flexibility was key. After the Maccabean victory, Jerusalem entered a period of Jewish self-governance under the Hasmonean dynasty. It was the last time Jerusalem would be independently ruled by a Jewish kingdom for over 2,000 years. The Hasmonean dynasty did not maintain its founders' idealism. By the 1st century BCE, it was a dynastic squabble. Two brothers, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, fought for the throne, both appealing to Rome for support. Rome was now the dominant power. The man they appealed to was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. Pompey was reorganizing Rome's Eastern Empire after his victory over Mithridates. He had a professional Roman army. When Pompey arrived, he assessed the situation and decided to support Hyrcanus, who seemed more amenable to Roman direction. Aristobulus's supporters barricaded themselves in the Temple Mount complex, a formidable fortress. The lower city fell quickly. The Temple Mount held. Pompey's siege lasted 3 months. The Romans built siege ramps on the northern side and deployed artillery to clear the walls of defenders. The defenders fought with courage but made a critical error. They refused to defend on the Sabbath. The Romans used the Jewish day of rest to advance their siege works. On a Sabbath, they breached the walls. The slaughter was severe. Many priests were killed while continuing their temple rituals, an act of devotion. Pompey did something that stunned everyone. He entered the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctum. He looked inside and then walked out without touching a thing. He did not loot the temple. After Pompey's conquest, Jerusalem became a subordinate city in the Roman province of Syria. Hyrcanus was confirmed as high priest, but given reduced political power. The Hasmonean kingdom was finished. Rome had arrived in the Levant, and it would not leave for centuries. If Pompey's restraint was noteworthy, his colleague Marcus Licinius Crassus had no such qualms. In 54 BCE, Crassus needed money for his campaign against the Parthians. He stopped in Jerusalem. He stripped the temple of everything Pompey had left, an estimated 10,000 talents of gold. He was not besieging the city. He had authority as a Roman official and simply took what he wanted. The following year, Crassus marched his legions into Parthia and was annihilated at the Battle of Carrhae. He lost his own life and the lives of 20,000 Roman soldiers. The Jews of Jerusalem did not weep for him. In 40 BCE, the Roman Senate declared Herod, son of Antipater, king of Judea. However, Antigonus, the last Hasmonean ruler, already occupied Jerusalem's throne, supported by Parthian forces. Herod faced the daunting task of conquering his own kingdom, a challenge that would span 3 arduous years. With Roman legions bolstering his own troops, Herod systematically subdued Judean cities one by one. Jerusalem itself was besieged from 38 to 37 BCE, a brutal and prolonged assault. General Gaius Sosius led the Roman legions, while Herod commanded his own forces, coordinating the assault. After 5 months, Jerusalem fell. Roman and Herodian troops looted and killed with abandon. Herod reportedly bribed his Roman allies to prevent the complete stripping of the temple. Antigonus surrendered, pleading for mercy from Sosius, but his fate was sealed. Sosius delivered Antigonus to Mark Antony, who ordered his execution. This marked the first time Rome executed a client king, signaling the definitive end of the Hasmonean order. Herod's control ushered in one of the ancient world's most remarkable building programs. He expanded the Temple Mount to its current dimensions, constructing massive retaining walls that endure today. The rebuilt temple became a wonder of the Roman world, a testament to his ambition. He also built palaces, fortresses, theaters, and aqueducts, transforming the landscape. Herod was a brilliant builder, yet also a paranoid and brutal ruler. Jerusalem under Herod became magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. But don't go anywhere. In a moment, we reach the single most devastating event in Jerusalem's history. A Roman general is about to inflict destruction so complete, so savage, it will take centuries to recover. The year is 70 AD, and the Romans are angry. No event in Jerusalem's history before or since matches the scale, ferocity, and historical consequence of the Roman siege of 70 CE. It was the catastrophe against which all other catastrophes were measured. It ended ancient Judaism as a temple-centered religion. It scattered the Jewish people across the empire and left Jerusalem a smoking ruin for a generation. And it was preceded by self-destructive political decisions. The Great Jewish Revolt began in 66 CE with a spontaneous uprising against Roman taxation and the provocative behavior of Procurator Gessius Florus. Florus had stripped the temple treasury. The initial revolt was successful beyond anyone's expectations. A Roman force under Cestius Gallus was ambushed. The Roman force of 12,000 men was destroyed in the Beth Horon Pass. The Zealot forces captured their eagle, a catastrophic humiliation for Rome. Nero responded by sending Vespasian, one of Rome's most experienced generals, with a force of approximately 60,000 men. Vespasian spent 67 and 68 CE systematically reconquering Galilee and Judea, closing in on Jerusalem like a fist. Then Nero died. Rome plunged into the year of the four emperors, and Vespasian was proclaimed emperor himself in 69 CE. Vespasian left for Rome, handing the Jerusalem campaign to his son Titus. Titus arrived before Jerusalem in April of 70 CE. He brought 4 legions, the 5th Macedonica, the 10th Fretensis, the 12th Fulminata, and the 15th Apollinaris. 60,000 soldiers in total. Each legion contained approximately 5,000 heavy infantry, plus cavalry and artillery. The Roman force was the finest military instrument of its age. Jerusalem, meanwhile, was tearing itself apart. 3 major Jewish factions were fighting each other in the streets as the Romans closed in. They burned each other's food stores. They assassinated each other's leaders. Josephus wrote that Jerusalem was its own worst enemy. Titus began his assault on the third and outermost wall in May of 70 CE. The Roman siege technique was methodical and relentless. Engineers constructed wooden towers as tall as the walls themselves, from which archers and artillery could suppress the defenders. Battering rams, enormous beams suspended on chains inside wheeled housings, pounded at the walls day and night. The Jews improvised countermeasures of great ingenuity, dropping burning torches on the siege machines, conducting night sorties to burn the siege works. They used grappling hooks to capture Roman rams and pull them inside the walls. The outer wall fell after 15 days. The second wall fell a few days after that. Then the Romans found themselves fighting in the narrow streets of the city. Their formation advantages were negated, and every alley became a killing ground. Titus pulled his forces back and began building a circumvallation wall. This siege wall encircled the entire city, over 4 miles long, constructed in 3 days by the entire Roman army working simultaneously. Nothing would get in or out. Inside the wall, famine became the dominant weapon. Josephus's account of what followed is almost unbearable to read. He describes people searching sewers for scraps of food, eating leather and hay, swallowing dirt. He records a woman named Mary of Bethazuba. Mary of Bethazuba killed and ate her own infant son. Tens of thousands of people died of starvation. Bodies piled up in the streets. When Jewish deserters fled to the Romans and were found to have swallowed gold coins, Arab and Syrian auxiliary soldiers began cutting them open. Titus ordered this practice stopped, but it had claimed the lives of 2,000 people. Those captured trying to escape were crucified in sight of the city walls. Josephus says Titus crucified 500 people a day at the peak of the siege. Wood ran out for crosses. The hills became forests of the dead. The Antonia fortress, the great tower that controlled the northwestern corner of the Temple Mount, fell after hard fighting in July. Then the Romans breached the Temple Mount itself. What happened next is disputed by the ancient sources in a revealing way. Josephus claims that Titus explicitly ordered the temple to be spared, and that a Roman soldier, against direct orders, threw a burning torch. The torch was thrown through a golden window during the fighting on August 9th, a date that corresponded to the anniversary of Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of the first temple. Titus, according to Josephus, tried to extinguish the flames but could not control his own soldiers. Other ancient sources suggest Titus deliberately ordered the temple burned. The Roman historian Tacitus implies something between the two, that the decision to destroy it was debated and that the majority favored destruction. Whatever the exact sequence, the result was the same. The temple burned. The gold of the walls and decorations melted and ran into the cracks between the stones. Roman soldiers tore the stones apart to get at it, fulfilling, in a devastatingly literal way, Jesus' prophecy that not one stone would be left upon another. The lower city held out until September, when it too was stormed and burned. Simon Bar Giora, one of the faction leaders, was taken to Rome. He was executed during Titus's triumph. The Arch of Titus, still standing in Rome today, shows Roman soldiers carrying the temple's great menorah. The casualty figures given by Josephus are almost certainly exaggerated. He claims 1.1 million killed and 97,000 enslaved, but they indicate an event of monstrous scale. Modern estimates suggest several 100,000 deaths from combat, famine, disease, and execution, with tens of thousands more enslaved. Jerusalem was left a ruin, its walls destroyed, its temple gone. The 10th Legion was garrisoned on the ruins to prevent reoccupation. The turning point of the siege was the Circumvallation Wall. Once Titus sealed the city completely, its fate was determined by mathematics. There was not enough food inside to sustain the population, and famine would do what armies alone might not. The internal divisions ultimately mattered less. After the siege, Jerusalem ceased to exist as a functioning city. The Romans leveled it. Judea was renamed to erase the Jewish connection. What had been the center of Jewish civilization was now a military camp on a hill of rubble. The final act of Roman destruction of Jewish Jerusalem came under Emperor Hadrian in 130 CE. Hadrian announced his intention to rebuild it, not as a Jewish city, but as Aelia Capitolina. Jewish religious practices, including circumcision, were reportedly banned, sparking widespread discontent. This led to the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 135 CE, led by Simon Bar Kokhba. It was the last great Jewish military uprising, remarkably successful for a time, liberating Jerusalem. Hadrian responded by recalling his best general, Julius Severus, from Britain, with 12 legions. The suppression was total. Bar Kokhba made his last stand at Betar, where he was killed in 135 CE. Catastrophic casualties followed, with towns and villages destroyed across Judea. Hadrian completed Aelia Capitolina. Jews were banned from entering the city under penalty of death. Only on the anniversary of the temple's destruction were they permitted to mourn at the ruins. Judea was renamed Syria Palestina, a deliberate act of historical erasure by the Romans. Everything changed in 326 CE when Constantine the Great converted to Christianity. For Christians, Jerusalem became the city of the Passion, where Christ was crucified and resurrected. Constantine's mother, Helena, made a famous pilgrimage, identifying holy sites. Constantine ordered the Church of the Holy Sepulchre's construction, transforming Jerusalem into a Christian holy city. Aelia Capitolina was now overlaid with Christian churches and pilgrimage routes, and the city grew. For nearly 3 centuries, Jerusalem existed as a Christian city under Roman and Byzantine protection. There were internal conflicts and religious disputes, but no major sacking during this period. That peace ended in 614 CE with devastating abruptness. The Sassanid Persian Empire under Khosrow II, led by General Shahbaraz, invaded the Levant. Their army included heavily armored cataphracts, horse archers, and a large Jewish auxiliary force. The siege of Jerusalem lasted 21 days. Defenders fought bravely from the walls. When the walls broke, Persians and their Jewish allies poured in, leading to a massacre. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was burned, and the True Cross was carried off to Persia. The Jewish community initially celebrated the Persian conquest as liberation, administering Jerusalem. However, Khosrow II reversed course, re-establishing Christian administration within a few years. The Jews who fought for Persia found themselves expelled from Jerusalem again. Persia held Jerusalem only until 629 CE, when Byzantine Emperor Heraclius launched a counteroffensive. He forced Persia to return conquered territories, including Jerusalem and the True Cross. Heraclius entered Jerusalem in triumph, restoring Byzantine rule, though it lasted less than a decade. The Arab armies that emerged from the Arabian Peninsula after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 CE moved with a speed and cohesion that shocked the established empires. Within 5 years, they had shattered a Byzantine army at the Battle of Yarmouk in 636 CE, one of the most decisive battles in history, and a Sassanid Persian army at Al-Qadisiyah. Both empires, exhausted by decades of war with each other, could not resist this new force. The Arab force was composed primarily of tribal infantry, camel cavalry, and horse cavalry highly mobile, motivated by a powerful new religious identity, and fighting under commanders of remarkable ability. Khalid ibn al-Walid, considered by many military historians to be the greatest Arab general who ever lived, had commanded the Yarmouk campaign. At Jerusalem, the commander was Amr ibn al-As, who had led the conquest of much of Syria-Palestine. Jerusalem was besieged in 637 CE. The Byzantine patriarch Sophronius, who commanded the city's defense, held out for months, not because he thought he could win militarily, but because he had heard a prophecy that Jerusalem would surrender only to a caliph. He sent word that he would surrender to Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab himself, and only to him. Umar came. The second caliph of Islam traveled from Medina to Jerusalem in a scene that became legendary. He arrived riding a donkey and wearing simple clothes, alternating riding with his servant to demonstrate humility. The patriarch handed over the keys of the city. There was no massacre. Umar entered the city peacefully, offered the city's inhabitants full protection of their persons, churches, and crosses, and famously refused to pray inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. When it was offered to him, he prayed outside instead, saying that if he prayed inside, Muslims would later claim it as a mosque. The church remained Christian. Umar went to the Temple Mount, which had been left as a garbage dump by the Byzantines, who wanted to physically manifest their belief that the destruction of the temple was divine punishment on the Jews. Umar cleared it himself, reportedly getting on his knees to remove refuse, and identified the rock from which Muhammad had ascended to heaven. Under later caliphs, the Dome of the Rock would be built over this site, one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. Completed in 691 CE, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque would be built at the southern end of the platform. The Muslim conquest of Jerusalem was the least violent major conquest of the city in its entire history. The terms were generous, the transition was orderly, and the city emerged relatively unscathed. Jerusalem now became part of the Islamic Caliphate, first the Rashidun, then the Umayyad, then the Abbasid, a status it would hold, with one brutal interruption, for the next 4.5 centuries. Jerusalem passed from Umayyad to Abbasid control in 750 CE without major violence. Under the Abbasids and then under the Fatimid Caliphate that took the city in 969 CE, Jerusalem remained a Muslim-administered city with substantial Christian and Jewish communities. Pilgrimage continued. The city was rebuilt and maintained. There were occasional violences. The Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah, in a period of apparent instability, ordered the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in 1009 CE, an act that horrified Christendom and helped fuel the rhetoric that would eventually produce the Crusades. The church was later rebuilt with Byzantine financial assistance, and al-Hakim's successors reversed his anti-Christian and anti-Jewish policies. But the destruction had been noted. In the cathedrals and monasteries of Europe, preachers were already beginning to speak of Jerusalem as a city that needed to be rescued. On the 27th of November 1095, Pope Urban II addressed a crowd at Clermont in France and called upon the Christians of Europe to march to the Holy Land and rescue Jerusalem from Muslim rule. He promised remission of sins to all who died on the campaign. The crowd's response, Deus vult, God wills. It became the war cry of the crusade. What arrived at the walls of Jerusalem in June 1099 was an army that had marched nearly 3,000 miles, surviving disease, starvation, near collapse, and internecine conflict to reach their objective. The leadership included Godfrey of Bouillon, the Duke of Lower Lorraine, a tall, physically imposing man of deep religious conviction; Raymond of Toulouse, older, wealthier, politically experienced; Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman adventurer of ruthless brilliance; and Tancred de Hauteville, his nephew, whose military ability was matched only by his personal cruelty. The combined force numbered perhaps 12 to 15,000 fighting men, down from the 40,000 or more who had left Europe. Jerusalem was held by a Fatimid garrison under Iftikhar ad-Dawla, the city's governor. The garrison expelled Jerusalem's Christian population before the siege, correctly judging that they might act as a fifth column. The city's walls were strong, its garrison numbered in the thousands, and it was prepared for a siege. The Crusaders' first assault on June 13th failed badly. Their scaling ladders were too short, they had no siege equipment, and they were repulsed with heavy losses. The situation was desperate. They were running out of food and water in the summer heat of the Judean hills, Muslim relief forces were en route, and the army was near mutiny. Then everything changed. Genoese ships arrived at Jaffa with timber and expert ship's carpenters. The forest of Samaria provided more wood. Within weeks, the Crusaders had constructed two massive siege towers, one led by Godfrey of Bouillon on the northern wall, one by Raymond of Toulouse on the southern, along with catapults and battering rams. The construction of these towers in the field from freshly cut timber was a remarkable engineering achievement. On July 14th, the final assault began. Raymond's tower in the south was repulsed, but Godfrey's tower, after fierce fighting, reached the northern wall on the morning of July 15th. A knight named Lethold was reportedly the first man across onto the wall. Godfrey himself followed. The gate was opened, and the Crusaders poured into the city. What happened next was one of the great atrocities of medieval history. The Crusaders killed almost everyone in the city. The Muslim population was massacred. The Jewish population, who had defended alongside the Muslims, fled to their synagogue and were burned alive inside it. The massacre lasted for days. Raymond of Aguilé, a priest who was present, wrote that in the temple area, the blood of the slain reached the knees of the horses and the bridles. This is hyperbole, but the reality it points to was horrific enough. Eyewitness accounts from both Christian and Muslim sources confirm that the killing was indiscriminate and enormous. The turning point of the siege was the arrival of the Genoese ships and the timber they brought. Without the siege towers, the Crusaders lacked the engineering capability to take the walls. The wood that arrived from Jaffa was, in a very real sense, what opened Jerusalem's gates. After the conquest, Godfrey of Bouillon was offered the title of King of Jerusalem. He refused, saying he would not wear a crown of gold where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. He became instead advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, one of the most curious political entities of the medieval world, was born. The Kingdom of Jerusalem lasted less than a century before it encountered the greatest Islamic military commander of the medieval world. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Saladin, had united Egypt and Syria under his rule, preparing for Jerusalem's reconquest. He was celebrated even by his Crusader enemies for his chivalry, intelligence, and military skill. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Hattin on July 4, 1187, one of the great decisive battles of the medieval world. Saladin's strategy was to draw the Crusader army into the waterless basalt plateau in high summer. The Crusader kingdom's entire field army marched to relieve the siege of Tiberias, finding themselves surrounded. Cut off from water, harassed by Muslim light cavalry and archers, they were eventually destroyed. The true cross was captured. King Guy of Lusignan was taken prisoner. The military force that had defended the Kingdom of Jerusalem was annihilated in a single afternoon. Without its army, the kingdom had almost nothing left to defend itself. City after city fell to Saladin's forces. Jerusalem was left with a skeleton garrison under Balian of Ibelin, a minor lord. He found himself the only man capable of organizing a defense. Balian's defense was improvised, but determined. He knighted every noble boy over 16 and every burgess he could find, conscripting an ad hoc force from the city's civilian population. Saladin's army numbered in the tens of thousands, vastly larger than what Balian had. The siege began on September 20th, 1187. Saladin initially attacked from the west, where the Crusaders had expected him. After several days, he shifted his assault to the northern wall, the same approach that had worked for so many conquerors before him. His engineers began undermining the walls. On September 29th, a large section of wall was brought down. Balian went to Saladin and negotiated a surrender. What followed stands in stunning contrast to the events of 1099. Saladin allowed the Christian population to ransom themselves. 10 gold pieces for a man, 5 for a woman, 2 for a child. Those who couldn't pay were enslaved, perhaps 15,000 people, but there was no massacre. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was not destroyed. The city was treated with a restraint that made Saladin a legend, even in European Christendom. The turning point of Jerusalem's fall was Hattin. By the time Saladin reached Jerusalem's walls, the city was already lost. Hattin had simply made it a mathematical certainty. After Saladin's conquest, Jerusalem became part of the Ayyubid Sultanate, though the Crusaders tried repeatedly to regain it, including the Third Crusade of Richard I of England, and the Sixth Crusade of Frederick II, who negotiated a peaceful return of the city in 1229, only to lose it again. Saladin's reconquest proved permanent as a long-term trend. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim rule for centuries. Following Frederick II's diplomatic coup of 1229, Jerusalem had returned briefly to Christian administration. The arrangement was always fragile, dependent on a balance of power that was about to be shattered by a force neither the Crusaders nor the Ayyubids had fully reckoned with, the Mongols. The Mongol advance into Central Asia had displaced enormous populations of Turkic peoples, among them the Khwarezmians, a fierce group of Turkish warriors who had once formed the army of the Khwarezmian Empire before the Mongols destroyed it. These displaced fighters, perhaps 10,000 strong, were hired as mercenaries by the Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt to deal with both the Crusaders and rival Ayyubid factions in Syria. In the summer of 1244, the Khwarezmians descended on Jerusalem. They were not a siege army, they were raiders. They overwhelmed the city's small garrison and entered Jerusalem, killing those who did not flee. The Christian population that had returned under Frederick's treaty was mostly massacred. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was sacked. The graves of the Latin kings of Jerusalem were opened and the bones burned. The destruction was catastrophic and total, but brief. The Khwarezmians did not hold Jerusalem. They moved south to join with the Egyptian army. That combined force then shattered the Crusader Ayyubid coalition. At the Battle of La Fourbi, effectively ending the remaining Crusader presence in the southern Levant, Jerusalem never returned to Christian control in the medieval period. The Khwarezmian sack of 1244 was the brutal, chaotic final punctuation on the Crusader era. The Mamluks, a military caste of enslaved soldiers, overthrew the Ayyubid dynasty in Egypt in 1250 and established one of the most formidable military states of the medieval world. Their most famous leader, Baybars, shattered a Mongol army at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, the first major Mongol defeat, and then systematically dismantled the remaining Crusader states. Under the Mamluks, Jerusalem was not subjected to major military assault. It was incorporated as a provincial city, administered by Mamluk governors and treated with a certain reverence as a holy city. The population was predominantly Muslim, but included significant Christian and Jewish communities. Jerusalem was, by medieval standards, a backwater. Cairo and Damascus were the great Mamluk cities. But it was maintained, its mosques and shrines cared for, its walls occasionally repaired. This relatively stable period ended when the Ottoman Turks, under Sultan Selim Mefretis, defeated the Mamluk army. At the Battle of Marj Dabik in 1516, Jerusalem surrendered without a fight. The transition from Mamluk to Ottoman rule was peaceful. The Ottomans recognized Jerusalem's religious significance and treated it accordingly. Under the Ottoman Empire, Jerusalem enjoyed 4 centuries of relative stability. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent rebuilt Jerusalem's walls between 1537 and 1541. These are the walls that still surround the old city today. The Dome of the Rock was retiled in magnificent blue Ottoman faience. The city was administered as a holy city, not a military installation. The 19th century brought new instability as the Ottoman Empire weakened. European powers competed for influence in the Holy Land. Jewish immigration, driven by pioneers and persecution, transformed Palestine's demographics. By 1914, Jerusalem was a city of 80,000, with substantial Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities. All living within walls Suleiman had built and the Ottomans maintained. The British campaign in Palestine during World War I was dramatic. General Sir Edmund Allenby arrived in Egypt in June 1917. He commanded the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, bringing resources and strategic vision. His army combined British, Australian, New Zealand, Indian, and South African troops. Opposing him were the Ottoman 7th and 8th armies, supported by German units. Allenby broke the Ottoman line at the Third Battle of Gaza in October-November 1917. He outflanked coastal fortifications with brilliant use of cavalry. The charge of the Light Horse at Beersheba was one of history's last great cavalry charges. It completely disrupted the Ottoman strategic position. By early December 1917, British forces advanced on Jerusalem. The Ottoman garrison chose to withdraw rather than fight for the city. On December 9th, Mayor Hussein al-Husseini walked out with a white flag. He surrendered to British Army cooks, then sergeants, then senior officers. On December 11, 1917, Allenby entered Jerusalem on foot, a gesture of humility, contrasting the Kaiser's ostentatious mounted entry in 1898. He read a proclamation, announcing respect for all 3 Abrahamic faiths. There was no sacking, no looting, no massacre. Jerusalem fell to a 20th century army with remarkable gentleness. The turning point was Beersheba, breaking the Ottoman position in an afternoon. Under British administration, Jerusalem became the capital of the Mandate of Palestine. Its future was bitterly contested by Jewish, Arab, and British visions. This led to the Arab-Israeli War of 1948 and the Six-Day War of 1967. The ongoing conflict continues to make Jerusalem the most contested city on earth. 3,000 years, more than 40 sieges, armies from Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, Arabia, and the Crusader states, the Mongol steppe, the Mamluk Sultanate, the Ottoman Empire, and the British Empire. All marched through these gates. Pharaohs, kings, emperors, generals, caliphs, sultans, and Crusader lords. All claimed this city, fought for this city, bled for this city. And yet Jerusalem has always come back. Every ruin became a foundation. Every conqueror left something behind, and Jerusalem absorbed it all, layer upon layer. Archaeologists digging in Jerusalem go down through civilizations. What makes Jerusalem unique is the weight of meaning humans have assigned to its stones. When Nebuchadnezzar burned the first temple, exiles in Babylon wept. When Titus burned the second temple, rabbis created a portable religion. When Crusaders took the city in 1099, they fell to their knees and wept. When Saladin retook it in 1187, he wept too. Jerusalem does that to people. It has done it for 3,000 years, and it shows no sign of stopping. To everyone who watched this documentary to the end, thank you, genuinely. History at this scale takes time, and you gave it yours. Jerusalem's story is not comfortable. It is filled with violence, fanaticism, and tragedy, but it is also filled with human courage, mercy, and a stubborn insistence on survival. If this documentary gave you a small piece of that story, it was worth making. If you found value, please share it with someone who loves history. Leave a comment with the moment that surprised you most, or the question this documentary left you with. And if you're not already subscribed, now is the time. Until next time, keep asking why. Cheers.